Good day to you. Today is Memorial Day, where we are celebrating, I suppose, or at least memorializing the fallen heroes of past wars. Now, of course, we should be adding the Ukraine, and maybe we should add the folks in Buffalo and in Texas and the many civil conflicts everywhere where people are dying that is not getting a whole lot of attention. Uh, so it is both a sense of thinking about folks as of the past who are no longer amongst us. And I guess we should think about how to make the world better, or at least try to understand it as best we can. Today, I want to talk about sort of not Ukraine itself, although we'll get back to it, and there's lots to say about Ukraine. Things are not going well as I speak for the Ukrainians. But Ukraine has had many fallouts and also interlinking with other events of the world. And I think historians will record, without any question in my mind, that not only has the Cold War era of 30 years since the end of the Cold War come to an end, but we are in very uncharted territory. We're in a new world order. Many of us try to understand it as citizens and as analysts, and all we can point to is the various changes that we can see at the moment. But how this will all wash out, I think, is still quite unclear, and one has to keep one's eye on it. But we are in a historic moment, and I think we should, we've sort of lulled ourselves into their events here, there, and yonder for the last few decades. But it's very often not the case that we know that we are in a historic change that is upon us. When a new war breaks out, sometimes we take note. But there's so many things going on in the world right now that it's hard to make sense of it. So I want to ramble a little about some of the fallouts of the Ukraine situation and link it with other events which are sometimes linked with Ukraine and sometimes are not. So one of the dominant fallouts of the Ukrainian war is that it has fundamentally changed the confluence is probably the wrong word, the context in which world affairs in general is being carried on. And the most obvious changes have taken place in Europe. First, because the flagging European Union has now gotten its act together to try to deal with the Ukraine situation, as well as NATO, whose function and purpose for many years wasn't very clear anymore, has now come into focus and into action. On the European front, what is interesting, and we've mentioned this before, is not only that the Europeans are pretty much solidified against trying to do something about the danger of Russia and the danger presented by the energy crisis, which is also linked with the sanctions against Russia, which have to do with Ukraine. But they're also running into some difficulty since we last talked, which is that Finland and Sweden, who now want to join NATO, which is the other half of the European, and in the case of NATO, beyond Europe, Canada, the United States, mechanism, is being challenged. So you have two challenges going on there. One is, in the case of the European Union, there is Hungary, which is increasingly a dictatorship and an authoritarian state. And again, since we last spoke, Orban, the head of the Ukrainian government, has taken on additional emergency powers, which essentially means he can now be a dictator of almost everything. And he is a member of the European Union, and this is a problem for the European Union. So on the one hand, Ukraine has brought the members of the European Union together and focused, and has renewed their sense that the European Union is important, and that Europe as a collectivity is important. On the other hand, it now has to worry about what happens if there are non-democratic states that are members. Can he be pushed? Should he be ousted? Should Hungary be suspended? None of this is terribly clear. On the side of Nato, obviously, Nato is very much involved in the Ukrainian business, even though, of course, Nato is itself not in the Ukraine, and is very careful not to overstep the boundaries of NATO membership. On the other hand, Finland and Sweden want to join NATO, which means an expansion. And in fact, if you look at a map, when we showed one last time, the Finnish-Russian border is very long. So rather than Putin having accomplished pushing the Europeans back from its borders and reclaiming some of the former East Europe, he's still trying to reclaim it, for example, in Ukraine, and he may try in Moldova and other places. At the same time, West Europe is trying to expand its engagement with NATO. The problem there is that Turkey, who is a member of NATO and has befriended Russia over some time, it has bought military airplanes and so forth from Russia, and the dictator Erdogan of Turkey has had rather friendly relationships with Russia. But on the other hand, Turkey is a member of NATO, and Turkey now wants to veto Finland and Sweden joining NATO because there are opposition individuals, Kurds to be precise, living in both of those countries, and he wants those countries to get rid of some of the Kurdish opposition to himself that is located in those countries. And in the next few weeks, that will have to be negotiated. That is to say, will Turkey back off? Can some accommodation with Turkey be found? Now, why is Turkey so important? Because for NATO to make a decision about new membership, all 30 members of NATO have to agree. So if Turkey doesn't agree, then presumably Sweden and Finland could not join. So that is a problem on that front. So I am saying that on the one hand, there are problems that both the European Union and NATO have to confront. On the other hand, the solidification of both of these organizations and a newfound purpose and focus is an important change in the world and in world affairs. Indeed, Europe as Europe is increasingly thinking that it needs to consolidate, not just in terms of Russian incursions and possible movement of Russia and trying to change the Russian control back over some of East Europe, but rather that Europe needs to consolidate itself in terms of playing a more major role in world affairs. And that relates to us, the United States, because one of the things that has happened in the last few years and is startlingly happened under Trump and is still with us is that we are the hegemon of the world. But on the other hand, the amount of respect and support that the US is getting around the world has been radically reduced. Under Trump, you will recall, we became more isolationist. We wanted to get out of NATO. We said we didn't need, European allies in particular. And so we had a situation where not only under Trump, but the electorate in the United States seemingly is moving, or a portion of it is moving towards a new form of isolationism on the one hand. And on the other hand, one of the virtues of the US as the hegemon of the world after the end of the Cold War was that, of course, it was the model for democracy. It was the model for human rights. And that has been tarnished very badly in the eyes of other countries. I mean, we almost lost our democratic institutional structure on January 6th, right? We came very close, and we may come close again. So our model democracy is badly tarnished. In addition, the disarray in American politics over gun control, over COVID, over other things has meant that the world looks upon us now as not the sort of the shining model for everybody to imitate, but rather a country that increasingly is presenting itself as being in internal turmoil, managing, for example, COVID very badly compared to other industrial countries, having opposition that seems to attack American institutions, and there is a sense that the role model of the U.S. is shaky, and all the more reason for Europe to step up and say, actually, we are in better shape in many ways, in terms of our democratic institutions, in terms of the European Union and how it's working, and in terms of sensible policies in a number of areas. Now, the other leg of this, of course, has to do with the degree to which Ukraine has impacted itself on the global economy. Now, it's not just Ukraine, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's also COVID and other things, but Ukraine has certainly contributed to it. So that for example, let's say we're all concerned about inflation at the moment. Inflation has a variety of reasons. Part of it has to do with COVID, shipping, access to things, shortages of various kinds. But but Ukraine and the US incapacity to address some issues has also had an impact on the global inflation, not just in the US, but around the world. Let me just illustrate it with one of the most startling examples. One of the virtues of dealing with Russia over Ukraine has been all these sanctions that have been applied, and the effort to very quickly get away from or reduce the dependence that European and other countries have on the energy sources that come from Russia. This has been perceived to be all to the good, right? Let's move more quickly because of climate change and other things, but also because the dependence on Russia has become apparent. Let's move much more quickly into other energy sources. But in the meantime, of course, the transition has been difficult. And so now you have a situation where we congratulate ourselves, and the world congratulates itself, on having put sanctions on Russia and having made life difficult for them, and trying to quickly reduce the dependence on Russian energy sources. But as soon as you reduce the Russian input into the energy world pale, so to speak, what you have is shortages. And the shortages means that those that now continue to produce energy raise their prices because they can. So when we go to the pump and we complain about the cost of gasoline, not all of it, but part of it is due to the fact that there are shortages in global energy, and there are dislocations in global energies, which are in part the consequences of the sanctions that we have applied and the urgency with which we have told people they need to get away from using Russian energy sources. I hope this makes some kind of sense. So while, as I'm saying, inflation has multiple causes, one aspect of inflation surely also has to do with the sanctions which on the one hand hurt Russia and are a good thing in terms of trying to bring Russia to heel over the Ukraine, but on the other hand are a way of increasing the prices of energy sources around the world, because renewable energies can't replace those sources very, very rapidly. I hope this makes some kind of sense, but it shows that on the one hand, you would think of gasoline prices and other things unrelated to the Ukraine situation, but you can see that you go from the Ukraine situation to policies towards Russia, and Russia being integrated in the world energy market, and that then having an impact on the economies of lots of countries. Now, for the United States, this essentially means we're all paying more at the pump, and poor people are having real difficulty getting to work and affording to get to work if they have to commute. On the other hand, it means what it means for very many of the so-called emerging economies, means that poor people are to the point where they simply can't afford life anymore. They can't afford their rents. They can't afford food anymore. So part of the increasing famine issues in the world, which I'll get to in a different context in a minute, are also energy linked and oil and gasoline production linked. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that things which seem an isolated problem, many of them hark back to the Ukraine situation, and in some senses are not directly linked, but rather in a sort of circuitous route. Now, the second thing that is startlingly changing the world affairs has directly to do with Ukraine as well, has to do with the food situation, which I've talked about before, and I don't want to belabor. But, roughly speaking, 40% of the world's wheat, for example, is Russia and Ukraine tied. And for many countries, let's take Egypt, 85% of its grains come from Ukraine and Russia. Country like Turkey, 76%, Pakistan, 88%, Lebanon, where people are also beginning to starve, 75%. So this is not a joke. This is not just that, grain prices and bread and so forth are going up slightly. It is that the poor in the poorest countries simply can't afford to eat anymore. Now, this is not a minor problem. This is a major problem. And it is duplicated on the one hand by the situation of the grains not getting to market from Ukraine and to some extent from Russia, but it's also duplicated by global warming, which means that countries which used to have a larger component of self-sustainability in their grain markets and now all of a sudden can't grow those grains anymore because there isn't the water and the climate has changed sufficiently radical. So here you have a perfect storm. You have, on the one hand, the global food situation, which is leading to shortages and radical price increases. We have maybe noted this even in the United States at our supermarkets, though that's also more complicated. It also has other reasons, but a combination of the Ukraine-Russian situation as well as the climate situation has fundamentally changed what was prevalent for almost 50 years, namely that there was actually adequate nourishment available in the world. And that is no longer the case. And while it's very serious as we speak, unless the circumstances change very quickly and Ukraine can somehow get some of its production, its wheat production to market, which it's not able to do so right now because the sea passages are blocked, there is expectation that you will have very, very serious famine in many countries in the world, all over Africa, the Middle East, parts of Asia, and so forth. As we speak, as I said, it has not gotten as serious yet as people expect it will be in the spring if things don't change. But it is also worth saying and repeating that in many countries in the world, the poor are malnourished and dying from malnourishment, and the child mortality rate has hugely increased in the world. So from a moral and ethical point of view, but as well as from a practical point of view, the impact of the Ukraine in part and climate change in another part has fundamentally changed the global perspective of the ability of even poor countries to at least keep their folks alive in some fashion and not go through a period of famine that has not existed, let's say, since the Second World War in various parts. So there is a kind of a spin-off effect off of Ukraine that, on the one hand, has led to the strengthening of Europe, and Europe seeing a new role in world affairs for itself. It has led to a spin-off that's very negative in terms of the well-being of lots of people in the world. And it has led, in part, to the hegemon, the US, the role model, no longer servicing the function it has of the US preaching to other people what they need to do or ought to be doing. That is to say, we in fact may still be very strong militarily and the strongest economy and all the rest, but our leverage over various issues in the world has been rather reduced, in part because of the Ukraine situation, but also very much so because, or even more so, because of the internal disarray in the United States. And, we came out of World War II as, the sort of, not only the role model, but the ideal for many people, both culturally and politically and economically. And that is eroding and continues to erode as we speak. And that is new. And what it means is that the balance of power that students of politics talk about has shifted already. How much it's shifted and how far and in what direction it will shift is still unclear. But, you had a bipolar world during the Cold War. Now you had 30 years of a US hegemony, a monopolar world. And now you're beginning to see in many areas the emergence perhaps of a multipolar world again, in the sense of, let us say, Europe becoming a stronger pole, China becoming a stronger pole, which is also a separate issue, or not entirely separate either. And you see that during the 50s and 60s in particular, much of the world in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa, the ex-colonial world, or the countries that transitioned out of colonialism, those countries were often neutral in the 50s and 60s. And that's sort of faded. That is to say, they became actors either independently or in subgroups in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth. And increasingly, you are beginning to get large groups of countries going into a neutral position again. On the one hand, they deal with Russia. Russia has supplied them arms. That's true in many places in Africa and in Asia. On the other hand, they're still have links with the West of one kind or another. And you can see the complexity of this, which I don't have time to discuss today, but will subsequently, for India, for example, which on the one hand is Western oriented. On the other hand, almost all its arms come from Russia. And so it's very careful to kind of stay neutral in this Ukraine situation. And increasingly, other countries are also saying, we're going to play ball with China and Russia and the West, and we're not going to commit to one group or the other entirely. They're playing it safe, and in some senses, for their purposes, they're playing it smart. But that means that the world order has changed, because you have China and the United States and Russia and Europe, but you also have a lot of countries that are increasingly sitting on the fence politically. And that is a very fundamental change, especially in the last few years. Now, I want to quickly identify two other issues, and that have contributed to almost everything I've talked about. One of them, of course, is climate change, right, which has impacted on food, which has impacted on the viability of many governments, which has helped authoritarians become more authoritarian. It has diminished the quality of life of many people in the world. Many people in the world thought their circumstances were getting better in Asia and in Africa in particular, and all of a sudden they've reverted to some years back. That is, say, not only are they not progressing anymore, but they're actually, their situation, their economic situation is actually getting worse. And that is not just a question of them going into a kind of more of a neutrality between amongst the major actors, China, Russia, and the United States and Europe, but also it leads to changes in their politics. So more and more countries around the world, which had sort of more or less democracies, semi-functioning, but still sort of functioning, are now having, for any to the naked eye, dictatorships, because their situation in their countries are in decline, and that allows dictators, authoritarian leaders, to take charge. So climate change and the Ukraine situation has led to political changes, not just in alliances, but also to political changes internal to countries. And that leads to destabilization, and the destabilization then becomes a problem for other actors, for the United States, for China, for Europe, and so forth. Another leg of the stool is globalization. And globalization has come under attack more in recent times as part of COVID as well, because we've gotten very used to the fact that, we were living in a world of globalization, and we've talked about that before. There are pros and cons to all of this. But COVID has led to a kind of re-examination of globalization, not just China, not just Russia, not just Ukraine, not just Europe and the United States, but all kinds of countries which were tied very intimately into the globalization network are now looking at themselves and saying, whoa, just like the United States is, we're too dependent on various countries for the supply of medical matters, for the supply of the expectations that people have in their markets, and so forth. And so there is a kind of pullback at the moment from globalization into saying, we need less interdependence and we need more independence. And that is rife and well in the United States as well. Notice ex-President Trump's speech at the NRA the other day. We should spend our U.S. money not with foreign aid or international things. We should, make, bunkers out of our schools and stop sending money overseas. And there's a large component of the American public which has become very isolationist and therefore very anti-globalization. Now, all of that is easier said than done, because in point of fact, technology has made globalization something that can't just be stopped overnight, right? We are quite interdependent in many ways, and certainly technology has made us interdependent. So while greater independence may be the political and economic move in many countries in the world, and certainly the Ukraine situation has increased that, as well as the food situation, and the COVID situation has increased that. Nevertheless, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And down the road sometime we should discuss to what extent globalization is alive and well, even at a time of attacks against globalization and greater desire to pull back into domestic economic and production, and less interdependence. Finally, I want to say that we had gotten used to, after the Second World War, to institutions not only reflecting globalization, but reflecting all the international law, human rights, moves towards democracy, and so forth, that emerged out of the Second World War, and that in one form or another, not perfectly, we have been living with. Whether you're talking about the World Bank, the United Nations, other, state institutions of one kind or another became the norm over the 50 years or so since most of them were set up. That system has also eroded, and has eroded simply because it is reflecting the issues of a bygone era. And the fact that it's reflecting the issues of a bygone era has been made so blatantly obvious because of the spin-offs of Ukraine. That is to say, Nato is functioning and has gotten a new life. But the agencies of the United Nations, some of them, certainly the Security Council, where nothing can be accomplished, either in terms of human rights or putting a cessation to the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. The whole United Nations system, as well as other institutions built to emulate that, are malfunctioning or not functioning at all, or limping along right now. And so one of the another spin-offs of the recent years, and very much so since Ukraine, is that serious people are going to have to look and saying, to what extent can these international institutions be reformed to deal with the new emerging world order rather than a previous world order which no longer exists or has seriously eroded. So that is a problem for all statesmen, it seems to me, and all countries. Whether people want to move more into regional mechanisms like the European Union, or whether or not you can resuscitate some semblance of a Security Council that can have some impact, is hard to say at this point. But it certainly is an issue, and it's an issue we need to keep our eye on. So what have I been rambling about here? I'm saying that Ukraine itself, because of the Russian invasion and the violation of and war crimes and the economic dislocations and the food dislocations that have flown out of the Ukraine situation, has had a big impact on refiguring what the world looks like and how to manage the world. And I am asserting, probably in some slightly exaggerated fashion, that the world order has changed in front of us, and very much so in the last year or so. And the new world order is as yet unclear in what direction we're going. I'm also saying that COVID and our general failure on COVID, but also the erosion of democracy in this country and the problems we've had with Trump and elections and the role we played under the Trump administration have eroded America's role model for the world. And while at the sort of base level of military and economic power, we are still a world hegemon, certainly our hegemonic input into world affairs has been tarnished. To the degree to which it's tarnished, to the degree we could put the genie back in the bottle again of the United States and reorder our own domestic situation, is still very unclear and might become slightly clearer either in the positive or negative sense in the next election, not just the midterms, but the next presidential election. But in the meantime, it's not just that all kinds of processes have changed and institutions have eroded, but also the role that the US was able to play has fundamentally changed, it seems to me, and we will see the fallout more and more in the weeks and months and years to come. And at the same time, you have, in some senses, a rise in Europe and the role that Europe is trying to play. And that, of course, even leaves aside the fact that we now have China and its role in the world, which I'll get back to in some subsequent subsequent talks. But I'm not trying to diminish the role of China here. I'm just simply saying that in 30 minutes, I couldn't be dealing with everything. Let me just end by saying the most important power in all of Africa right now are not the prior colonial powers. It's not Russia. It's not the United States. It's China. China is involved in every African country, more or less, and is the dominant outside power. So you get some sense also that China, in some sense, is unrelated to Ukraine, but also as part of the systemic changes that we're going through, also needs to be reckoned with and is an actor we have to get back to. So I hope you're having a good weekend, and I hope some of this makes sense, and see you the next time. Thank you.